So I'd like to introduce next Professor Robert Mulley, retired, and he's a member of the New South Wales Game Board, and he'd like to talk to you about what's been going on there. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Doug, and good afternoon, everyone. Just want to tell you a bit about who the Game Board is and some of our activities. So let's do this. Here we go. So Doug asked me to address three particular things. What the Game Board has been doing over the last 4 years. We're 4 years into a 5-year term. I'll introduce the board and some of the things that we do. Provide evidence of social and political threats affecting the long-term security of our recreational pursuits. And thirdly, how can interested and qualified people apply to be on the Game Board, which is probably the question that so many AHOs ask of their members anyway. Okay, those parts, who is the board, what was the appointment process, functions, how do we operate, and some of our achievements so far. It's part one. So we're comprised of, pardon me, 7 individuals up until just recently with the rider at the bottom there. We all come from a hunting background. In my particular case, I'm a several generation hunter, still an active hunter with my 2 sons. Each of the members of the board have a diverse background, somehow related to hunting, where they can bring specialist expertise to the table. In my particular case, I was a bit taken aback when Rod Drew painted such a poor picture of academics earlier today. Yes, I am an academic, and but I like to think that I've got a little bit of common sense in the background there. And I also sit on the Kangaroo Management Advisory Panel that sets the commercial quota for kangaroos in New South Wales, the Animal Research Review Panel, which is a welfare-based organisation, government organisation that looks at the use of animals for research and teaching across New South Wales, and I was on the Biosecurity Advisory Committee. So I've got a broad background there where I can bring particular things to the table. Kath Clapham is an educator who lives in the Lower Blue Mountains. She was a previous chair of the Sydney branch of the ADA. She is married to a gunsmith and has particular expertise in the area of education. Justin Clark from Nowra is a veterinarian. He's a specialist in chemical capture and a number of other areas, but particularly brings to the table his expertise in the diseases of wildlife, which can be either zoonotic diseases, which are diseases that can affect hunters as well as animals, and that's particularly important in a number of areas. Christine Hall is a grazier from northern New South Wales, and her and her husband Joe are long-term big game hunters. They leave Australia every year. They hunt in Australia as well, so they have a different perspective to many of us. David Voss is the current national president of the ADA. He's a recreational hunter, but doesn't wear the ADA hat. We're an independent group of people. Graham Hall, who I've just got a rider on at the bottom there. He's recently been appointed to a position at Botswana University as a Director of Research, so he will leave the board in the next, well, he's left the board now. He's in Africa as we speak. So when we come to be replaced later this year as a board, he won't be likely to be there unless he gets sacked from his current job. Andrew Glover, past Rural Land Protection Board slash LLS expertise. Andrew's got an enormous expertise in the management of feral animal populations, and brings quite a long history of that sort of management of wildlife. Plus, he's an active range steward at the Silverdale range and is quite an expert in firearms. So there you have it. It's a board comprised of people who hunt and have a good background in hunting. Okay, so in 2014, in October, we were appointed as a board for a 5-year term. We're subject to the control and direction of the Minister, except where with regard to advice provided to the Minister, which is one of our functions. We're established to provide that advice to the Minister on issues relating to game and feral animal management when asked. So it's obviously up to us to try and keep abreast of what's happening out there so that we can represent the interests of licensed hunters to the Minister. And we are an independent group that sits utilising administrative support from the Game Licensing Unit, but we are not attached to the Game Licensing Unit, and in fact we operate very similarly to the Recreational Fishing Advisory Board, Justin. So, the 4 functions under the Game and Feral Animal Control Act that the board represents to represent the interests of licensed game hunters in matters arising under that Act. We provide advice to the Minister and have done so on a number of occasions on game and feral animal control. We provide advice on request on priorities for research expenditure which might provide information. There's been a lot said today about evidence-based decision making, and if we've got a mantra at all, it is that, in the words of the late Don Chipp, we try and keep the bastards honest, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And indeed, as a board, part of what we try and do is make sure that when information comes our way, such as the NRC report and so forth, we want to vet that information to make sure that decisions are not made on anecdote, that there's actually support behind that. And that was one of the frailties of that particular report, which I note that this group also made a submission about. And we provide advice to the Minister on regulatory authority and educational courses relating to game hunting. Okay, and there are a number of those sitting in the wings. So the way we operate, we hold 4 board meetings a year. They're usually of 2 to 3 days duration, and quite a number of occasions now we've had to have a teleconference between meetings because something has arisen that is of major importance that we need to discuss and maybe put a submission in on. So that happens. We form an agenda based on issues that arise between meetings and build on correspondence that we receive also from people who write into the board on matters that are affecting them. We also form the agenda around information we receive from meetings with hunters and AHOs at the end of our board meetings. We've been holding meetings not in the one place. We travel around the state to various areas, plus we've had one meeting in southern Queensland, and we're about to hold a meeting in Victoria to connect with as many hunters and AHOs as possible, and many of those AHOs in southern Queensland and in parts of Victoria are registered with the New South Wales Game Licensing Unit, so we have representation of those people. We usually try and incorporate guest speakers at our meetings. They're people who might be from the local LLS or OEH, could be a DPI speaker on some research that's taking place somewhere, or researchers from a university doing research that's of interest to the game board, and local farmers where there's a particular issue that they might be dealing with, such as the case recently when we took a meeting to Jindabyne, and obviously farmers down there were worried about the large population of deer in that area. The university researchers that came in particular were talking about Brucella suis, which is a bacterial disease in feral pigs at the moment in northern New South Wales, infecting their pig dogs, and is also a zoonotic disease. and indeed a young woman veterinarian recently aborted after having treated pig dogs in Queensland. So they're of particular interest, and we try and bring that information back and make sure it's available to hunters so that they're aware of these sorts of things. We usually try and combine our board meetings with a field trip of some kind. We try and get some first-hand knowledge of the area that we're holding the meeting in, some of the issues that are being faced by the local people there, either in government instrumentalities or farmers, compliance staff activities and how they go about their work, and what that might mean in terms of the reputation of hunting in that area, and anything else that the board may need to get to know about, so that we can give reasonable advice to the Minister should we be asked. We, at the end of each of our meetings up until now, we've convened a meeting with AHOs in the area. So it's usually held on, we try and have our meetings on a Thursday and Friday, so that on a Friday night, when it's possible for representatives from local AHOs to get to an open meeting, we convene that meeting with a bit of food and beverage, so that we can hear what's troubling them, what they've been dealing with. And one of the things that, apart from us getting good information back from those meetings on what's happening in the local area, what it's shown for us is that there's a tremendous amount of misinformation out there still, and even hunting clubs who are probably more on the ball than people who are not affiliated with hunting clubs really not sure about a lot of the legislation, a lot of the work that the Game Licensing Unit does, and we've been able to correct a lot of that stuff firsthand in those meetings, and I think that's been highly valuable to the groups anyway that have represented at those meetings. So, and we operate like any other board. We've got a charter. We all operate under a code of practice. Some board members, including myself, are affiliated with other organisations, but all decisions that we make as a board are extant from those affiliations, and so we truly try to operate independently. So just to give you a bit of a look at the sort of things in the top left-hand corner there, one of the compliance officers has the board representatives in a state forest, just illustrating first of all the dimensions of the area of the work there, how they go about surveillance of the activities in that forest to make sure it's safe for all of the people who use the area, and some of the technology used to keep our compliance officers really on the ball there. It was really quite remarkable to see that in action. In the top right-hand corner, we're talking with some rice farmers down in the Riverina who are very pleased and keen to have a register of hunters who can go and assist them to mitigate crop damage by ducks. That's me checking out some duck damage down in the bottom left-hand corner. Some of the stories we hear is that you know, some of these farmers are having to replant their crop as often as 2 and 3 times a year because of the damage that can be done in just a couple of nights. If a couple of thousand ducks descend on a property, they can do a huge amount of damage in a couple of days, and of course that's a huge economic loss and a time loss for the farmers. And in the bottom right-hand corner, that's a goat trap out in the Western Division, where we're not allowed to call goats feral goats. They're rangeland goats because they are now valuable to farmers. I refuse to actually use that word where I can get away with it. I understand the economics of it. I think that's really great for farmers who can cash in on a a resource like that. However, we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that you know, goats do a lot of environmental damage too, and you know, to keep a broader spectrum of people on side with hunting and hunting outcomes, we need to take a more middle of the road stance than to call them rangeland goats. Okay, so Doug asked me to talk about achievements of the Game Board so far, and we heard earlier that the economics of hunting is really an important leverage out there. So I'll just defer the outcomes of that report for a moment, but suffice to say that we, as a board, encouraged the Game Licensing Unit to conduct that hunting economics survey, and we got support from government to use some funds to do that. Game bird research, there's very little doubt in my mind that we can increase the hunting opportunities in New South Wales and the economics of hunting significantly if we could get a more reasoned approach to game bird hunting in this state. At the moment, it's quite difficult. It's bound by rules about crop damage mitigation and so forth. But I can't say any more except to say that that's very much on our mind, and I think that we'll try very hard. We've started to put together some of the evidence needed to background how that might happen, and we've done some research on census techniques for quails and ducks and so forth, so that when the time is right, we would like to actually use those approaches to background why we think it's probably feasible. As most of you that are as old as me in here know, the reason duck hunting in New South Wales was banned by Bob Carr was purely political and was not evidence-based. There was no science behind that, and indeed I had a lot to do with surveying waterfowl with the CSIRO wildlife research before that decision was taken, and we knew more about ducks and indeed kangaroos from a different area, but we knew more about waterfowl and ducks in New South Wales than most other wildlife species. So there was no evidence to support that. It was purely political. In our representation around the state, we've met with at least 60 AHOs across New South Wales and a large number of people outside of the AHO spectrum. 17 board meetings, the 18th is about to come up. We've developed position statements on a range of pest species so that should the Minister need some quick advice from the Game Board on a number of pest species and indeed other areas of concern like pig dogging and other issues, we've got a number of position statements just sitting there ready for access. They've taken a bit to put together, and we have to continually update those. Each year we have to make an annual report on our activities to the Minister, and within those reports are a set of research priorities. It's interesting, in order to prepare for today, I went back to our very first meeting where we considered, which was the second meeting by the way of the board, but that was where the first meeting where we considered research priorities for the board to look at, and the first 4 research priorities have been initiated and indeed finalised in most cases. So there's been some good work done, even though it takes a while to get the evidence and progress. And members of the board have also been representing hunter interests at conferences. I went to a citizen science conference in Canberra and was astounded to see the range of research projects happening across Australia, where there is no doubt that recreational hunters who spend an enormous amount of time every weekend in remote places that the scientists can't get to. And citizen science is a branch of science where other interested individuals other than the scientists can collect information in a scientific way, in a reasonable way, that can contribute to the knowledge base. And it's good for hunters to be involved in those sorts of things because that's a credibility tick, but it's also a human interest tick. Most of us like to go into the field. We make observations other than the observations on the game that we're hunting, and so we might see birds that we recognise and so forth. There are all sorts of ways in which we can contribute information into the scientific database. I think that was a really good eye-opener, and we've talked about citizen science ever since on the board. It's a way of hunter engagement. Advances in conservation through sustainable use of wildlife was held in Brisbane last year after a 22-year gap from the first conference. That was really valuable too because there were a very large number of presentations, including quite a number from New South Wales, where people presented work on harvesting wildlife, but making sure that sustainable use was at the forefront of the presentation. So that was really good. And last year went to the New South Wales Vertebrate Pest Symposium in Coffs Harbour. Now that was organised by LLS. LLS have just recently been charged with the responsibility of setting up regional pest committees. That's an outcome of the NRC report, and then the government response to that said that LLS would be put in charge of setting up regional pest committees across New South Wales. As a board, we were watching this with huge interest because indeed the government response said that hunters should be part of those regional pest committees and should be represented on them. As a board, we realised that this wasn't happening, and we made a representation directly to the Minister's office and wrote submissions pointing out this. And indeed, the good thing about the current Minister that we have is that at that meeting he said, right, we'll make sure that hunters are represented now in stage 2 of this process, and I'm hoping that that happens, but we're watching with great interest to make sure that that does happen. The second stage of those pest committees are currently being formed. We staged a hunters forum in 2017 at Penrith. I recognise some of the faces in the room were there at that. How many people were there at that hunters forum? Yeah. That was really good for the board because in a nutshell we were able to capture quite a large number of ideas. All of those ideas went into a final report on that, which was then forwarded to the Minister as well. And we indeed, that's our conduit of making sure that the Minister knows a bit about what's happening with recreational hunting and hunting generally in the state, because minutes of the meetings with our AHO groups all get forwarded to the Minister straight after the meeting. We've recently made a submission to the Senate inquiry into the impact of feral deer, pigs and goats in Australia. If you look through the submissions that are on the net, there are quite a large number of submissions on there, 64 or 5. Probably only 2 or 3 have any evidence-based points in them, that is peer-reviewed information backing what's in those. And we point that out on a continuing basis. I note that people talk about evidence base in all of the other talks as well. It's clear that we need more information out in some of these areas to support the decisions, and I guess as a board that's what we're trying to make sure we do, that we put in place research or effort into getting the information that can back some of these judgments, and where it's not available, tell people that they're talking through their hat. Submissions and representation to Minister Blair Now, I've already said to you that we're lucky. We've got a minister who actually listens, who understands fishing and hunting, and he engages in those things himself and comes from a rural background. I might be at odds here with plenty of people in the room, but I'm hoping he remains the minister after the state elections. I did miss that point 3 there, that in the formation of the regional pest committees, Christine Hall, one of our board members, is a member on the Northern Tablelands Regional Pest Committee, and I've just been included on the Greater Sydney Regional Pest Committee. At least we've got a bit of an insight into what's happening in those pest committees, which are representative of the other pest committees across New South Wales, I guess, because there's a lot of preempted information in the documentation. I was also invited to the Hastings Wild Deer Management Strategy. That's been running for quite a while now, and they've been complaining about a wild deer problem in the Hastings around Port Macquarie area. They've had a committee. It hasn't been very active until just recently. They asked for a suspension of regulations there, and the Game Licensing Unit allowed that suspension of regulations. As a board, we've recently written to it's now completed the suspension period. We've written to the Hastings Wild Deer Management Group seeking information on whether that made a difference or not, because obviously a lot of people who are deer hunters were worried about the suspension of regulations and what that might mean. What it's demonstrated to us is that even though the regulations were suspended, not that many deer were taken, and very poor information gathering took place as a part of that suspension of regulations. So when asked specific questions about how many deer per man hour and so forth, what was the age breakdown of the animals taken, sex ratios, that none of that was collected. So, you know, basically we started from a position up there of not knowing how many deer, just a speculated number, and at the end of it we still don't know any of that, and we don't even know much about the animals that were harvested. So as far as I'm concerned, that's a poor effort. Sorry if there's somebody in here from the Hastings area, but you really need to, if you're going to have evidence to support your claims, then you have to collect that evidence at the time. There's no point in coming and saying, oh, well, we shot 60 deer or 80 deer or something like that. That doesn't mean a thing. We don't know about the population and what that means in real terms. Also, David Voss and I were on the New South Wales Wild Deer Management Strategy, and that was a demonstration of the broad spectrum of ideas that we encounter when we're trying to put a sensible document together. There were ideas from the extreme left, ideas from the right, you know, some in between. It was actually quite difficult to get a lot of sense. There were probably too many people engaged in that effort. It was quite a large committee, and the more people you've got on a committee, the harder it is to make sense of it at the end. And our annual reports to the Minister is a way of getting information back. Now, it might be of interest to you to know that recently the federal government, some of you probably know this, funding an economic study of the value of shooting sports across Australia. That, I think, will be really, really helpful. We don't know if that was prompted by the outcomes of valuing the economic contributions of hunting in Victoria and New South Wales, but I suspect that our reports didn't go unnoticed, and I'm about to talk to you about that in a minute. Some of the key stakeholder issues that we encountered at meetings with AHOs, a lot of people were interested in how to go about accessing public and private land for hunting. That was an issue for their clubs. The current status of game licensing in New South Wales, as I said, you know, even though the AHOs are pretty up to speed, you would think, about this, a lot of people didn't know just exactly how the licensing system worked. There were concerns over illegal hunting and the reputational damage that illegal hunting was doing to their local clubs. The public perception of hunting is guided often by what they read in the newspaper about break-ins, theft, rural crime generally. The NRC report and the impact that was going to have on hunting activity in New South Wales. As I said to you, the NRC report was full of unsubstantiated claims, basically, and quite frankly, when that was pointed out very strongly in our submission and in other submissions, and I think the government certainly addressed that as well in their response. Similarly, the LLS Regional Pest Committee documentation that's come out, the first iteration of that, there's a lot of anecdote and he said, she said sort of stuff in there, and we've taken that to task as well and submitted some information to the Minister's office to ask for a more creditable documentation of that process. Discussions on changes to firearm laws, other things like that, the Bradshaw Review, travelling with firearms, sound moderators, there's a whole range of other things that we keep in the back of our mind. And some other topics, for instance, when the biosecurity, the national guidelines came out in 2015, New South Wales had to be compliant by July 1, 2017. I was on the committee in New South Wales. Again there you're fighting with people who have extreme views, and you didn't hear it from me, but the Invasive Species Council is quite difficult to talk to.
Really?
You know what I'm talking about. Okay, so the general biosecurity duty, obviously hunters are impacted by this, and indeed most hunters are very, very good. They keep all of their gear clean. We certainly need to be kept informed about disease management, property to property, and the way in which we should act when moving around the countryside, making sure that we take into account our general biosecurity duty. All members of the population are asked to do that in some form or other, so rather than toss an apple core out the window or a peach seed, those are the sorts of things that you see evidence of out there. Wasn't necessarily a hunter, but that's biosecurity is trying to maintain the invasion of new pathogens and plants and diseases into areas that it doesn't currently occur in. Other research, finding out what hunters want, which I've explained already, and the game bird census. Hunter representation, been there, citizen science, zoonotic diseases. So are you all aware of Brucella suis and the potential for danger there as a hunter? If you go to northern New South Wales into an area where Brucella suis is now endemic in some of the feral pig population, you bring your hunting dogs back to other parts of New South Wales, you have a chance of bringing that back with you if you've been feeding your dogs pigs or if they've been in contact with pig carcasses. Illegal hunting, we know that that's quite a scourge that we need to deal with in a whole range of different ways. So that's a very important topic in our meetings. And the last one there is something that we need to be more aware of. I think the difference between cultural hunting, which most of us probably got involved in hunting through cultural connections, and wildlife management hunting, which is more about now population knockdown, going and making sure that you don't just take a trophy animal and leave the rest. It's about shooting females as well as males in a population, and a whole range of other initiatives so that you manage the hunting resource but in a way that's more socially acceptable, I guess, to some of the people who don't support hunting because they think that hunters are out there protecting their patch. So, the growing concern about economic, social and ecological impacts of pest animals and some game animals in New South Wales, example deer. In that case, deer hunters are encouraged to, in areas where there's a high population of deer, to not just take one animal for meat, but maybe take more animals and make sure that there's a bit of a population knockdown happening at the same time. That keeps them in good with the property owners and managers, and they also still get their venison. Now, I've been wanting to get to this because I think this is one of the things that has been particularly important in the last few years. The economics of hunting survey work that we've done. It was preempted by Hunting in Victoria. That was, they set up some algorithms. The work was done, commissioned by DSE Victoria, but they got RMCG to do the work, and that's a major firm where they set out a whole range of parameters and did the survey work and came up with a figure of $442 million per annum to rural communities in Victoria. And that raised a few eyebrows and was of political importance down there. At about the same time, Neil Finch and others up in Queensland decided to try and find out more about the value of hunting across Australia, and they used similar algorithms and came up with $1.2 billion per annum. However, they obviously either didn't have quite enough information in there or didn't collect enough information, because when we supported the development of an economic impact of hunting in New South Wales study, it turned out, I heard Andrew say 1.52 billion. I've got 1.7 billion here. There might be a discrepancy of a bit of money, but the long and the short of it is, it's a massive amount of money. And that made some eyebrows raise in areas that meant that hunting was seen in a slightly different light, politically and socially. And not only is there an economic value in there, there's a social value in the removal of a large number of feral animals. We're not alone in this, and just to give it a bit of perspective, hunting economics across the world are huge, and estimated value in the Northern Hemisphere alone is $60 billion per annum with a 3 times multiplier, and it engages a huge number of people. And so those numbers are pretty massive, but we're dealing here in Australia with large numbers too, and we shouldn't forget that. That's a positive for us. You know, we've been talking about the impediments to our progress as organisations and as hunters, but indeed the sort of evidence that we've just collected on the economics of hunting is a huge plus. That's the first real bit of information we've got about that, rather than the speculation that was happening before. So things that we know about hunting in New South Wales, we know that integrated pest management involves ground shooting. That's one of the planks of an integrated pest management program. The NRC report acknowledged that recreational hunters had a role to play in pest animal management programs. So that was a plus, even though there are other frailties in the documentation. The Game Licensing Unit, as of a couple of days ago, has 20,721 licensed hunters in New South Wales, and that's only a small proportion of the number of gun owners in New South Wales. We know that. The Supplementary Pest Program, despite what some people will tell you, administered by the OEH, was successful as an alliance between agency staff and hunters. It was small. It hasn't been progressed beyond that experimental stage. I think more's the pity for that. OEH can't give you a reason why that is, and they can't say that it wasn't successful either. at the Shooters Forum, we had an OAH person who was engaged in that come and talk to us, and indeed he outlined that, almost reluctantly I think, but he outlined that the program had been successful. So there are many examples of successful long-term relationships between property owners and hunters out there. Most of the people in this room probably are engaged on private properties. Office of Environment and Heritage, or National Parks and Wildlife as they used to be known. So Doug asked me to quickly provide evidence of social and political threats affecting the long-term security of our recreational pursuits. And this is where anecdote and lack of evidence run wild. So one of the areas, poor journalism. There's no doubt that anybody can go and write an article, put it in the Land or somewhere else. I see it all the time, and if we responded to all of the grey literature out there that really is not factual, we would have full-time jobs. I'm retired, I can't do that, but suffice to say that that's why we need evidence in a lot of these things. Political activism, we've just recently, in the last 12 months, been faced with the situation of examples like farmers and others using foot and mouth disease as a plank to get stuck into deer populations across the state. Now, as late as on Thursday night, I was with a veterinarian who was just on a government-sponsored tour of the subcontinent where foot and mouth disease is endemic. And indeed, when put to him that in 2002 in Great Britain, deer were basically considered a non-event in terms of the spread of foot and mouth disease, and he said, and Rob, it wouldn't be here either. There's no doubt that they are not good carriers of foot and mouth disease, yet people can get out there, write an article in the Land and use that as leverage to try and convince everybody that we should just go and helicopter shoot large numbers of deer. Okay, so misinformation out there is really one of our enemies. The other thing, the kangaroo, anti-kangaroo shooting lobbyists have recently produced a video of kangaroos being towed behind a ute, supposedly with a joey in the pouch. And anyway, to cut a long story short, it was obviously a setup. They had the cameras right in the right position to get all the video on. It was supposed to be a covert operation, but we lost 2 international export markets within a short time of that video being released. So that sort of stuff is what we face as a group in the hunting industry. Change of government. I'm worried about change of governments because we've got a good working relationship with our current minister and the current government. I'm waiting with bated breath to see what happens in March, but I hope that we still have a basis for working with the government easily. Social issues, the reputational damage that about poor behaviour in the wider rural community has been used incessantly to tell us why hunters aren't allowed on private property, and so it goes on. Lack of trust of hunters, pig doggers chasing their dogs across property boundaries, cutting fences, rural theft of fuel and livestock, etc., etc. These are the things that keep being thrown up as impediments to our progress in making sure that hunters still have places to hunt. And entrenched views in OEH, for instance, on the problems of hunters in national parks is something that we need to try and work through, because indeed the evidence of the supplementary pest program showed that it worked, and also that hunting has been in national parks in Victoria for a very long time now without problem. So these are things that keep being thrown up. So you don't have to worry about this slide too much. I know I'm running out of time, but as hunters, education of the wider community on the positive contributions that hunters are making in terms of biosecurity and other pest control positives need to be put out there. A number of people have spoken about the need for making sure that we educate people in the hunting fraternity, I think we probably have to go wider than that and make sure that the wider community, they're our biggest danger, because there's a very large number of uninformed people out there. Okay. How can interested and qualified people apply to be on the game board was the third plank that Doug asked me to talk about. The process is likely to be like this. In about May or June this year, applications will be called for to fill the roles of a board chair and board members, active from about end of October. There'll be a recruitment process take place. That'll be in line with government standards like the appointment standards, boards and committees in the government sector, and New South Wales Government Boards and Committee guidelines, which I'm sure are available on the net but will be made available at the time. As legislated, the advisory board is to consist of not more than 8 members, including the chair, appointed by the minister, whoever that is. The board is to contain representatives of regional New South Wales. This does not mean that each and every member must be from regional New South Wales. The board is to include persons who together have expertise, skills or knowledge in the areas of pest management, wildlife, veterinary science, hunting, education and community engagement, and they're likely to be appointed for a term of 5 years. That's all I've got to say. Happy to take questions.
Okay, Rob, just 2 questions. First of all, the presentation you've made, is that available to the people here, like in written form?
It's up to Doug.
Well,
it's available as far as I'm concerned.
Okay. Doug, could you take that on board, please? That's the first question. The second question is in relation to May, June this year and the replacement of the board. Do you have any information from the minister or from anybody else as to how the government would handle, I'll use the word continuity. In other words, are any of the board members able to be reappointed or not?
Yes, they are able to be reappointed.
Just going back to your comment about the regional pest committees and the fact that recreational shooters or hunters weren't really part of them in the beginning, what is LLS's feeling towards the minister basically telling them now that they have to have us on there, considering the fact that their draft pest reports that they did, I think only one of them actually mentioned recreational shooters as a stakeholder?
Yeah, you're right. That was what we took odds at with. I can't.
Are they having us there kicking and screaming? Are they willing? Do you think they're willing to work with us, or are we just going to be there as a tokenistic?
If we can get hunter representation, I think they're willing to work with us. Certainly, that's been my personal experience on the Sydney group. I was only allowed to be on the Sydney committee, the Sydney Region Committee, as an observer in the first instance. But in the second round, and I've been to one meeting now, basically I was made a committee member because, first of all, I went there to make sure that what I was hearing was kept on the straight and narrow a bit, and secondly, though, I was able to make useful contributions. And that's true of what's happening with Christine Hall in Northern Tablelands. I don't know exactly what's happening with other committees, and I don't know if Andrew has any better information than I have on that, but they're certainly into that second round, and we should... Look, the Minister gave a clear indication on our meeting that that would be the case, and I take him at his word at this stage. Yeah. He in fact told the head of LLS that was to be the case from that day on. So hopefully that message got through.
Just got a really quick question. You mentioned earlier about this citizen science program. Who were these citizen scientists, and what sort of other data are they asking for with regards to the other animals in the environment?
I got the shock of my life when I went to the first conference of citizen science, which was held in Canberra. Mm-hmm. And the chief scientist at that stage was Professor Ian Chubb, and he's now retired from that position, but he announced at that meeting that in the 5-year rollover budget, a huge amount of money had been set aside for citizen science projects. The number and range and types of people engaged in those were for things like, well, there was WOMSAT, where if you saw a wombat, you could identify it on an app. If it had mange, you could indicate that. They're pretty, you know, often you only see a wombat in the daytime because they're crook, for instance. There were other people dealing with feral cats. There was a major range of research. I work as a scientist in the area. I had no idea.
Yeah, the only reason why I asked is just from I guess I'm going to translate some of the experience from fishermen.
Yep.
And probably over the last decade with regards to the way that marine parks have been implemented. A lot of these marine parks and the areas that are sanctuary zones and lockout zones were implemented based on a similar consultative process where they sought information from anglers. Basically, hey guys, can you guys just tell us where you saw the grey nurse sharks so that we can protect them? But hey, we're not going to lock you out of fishing there. Hey, whereabouts are you guys catching all these fish? We just want to make sure so that we don't put a marine park there. And then when the truth gets out, they went and actually put the marine parks right on top of the places they told everyone they wouldn't. So I guess, look, I don't know these people that you're dealing with. I don't know what their motives are. I guess I'm just trying to say, be careful, you know, because maybe they don't have your back. Like I said, I don't know them, you do, and I'll trust your opinion on it. But from our experience, yeah.
Well, you probably, that's a good precautionary tale. I was going to say to Justin, probably over a coffee, one of the things I've noticed with the fisheries laws and changes in other places where licence fees have been put back into the fishery. I'm a very keen fisherman. I fish in St George's Basin mostly. There are artificial reefs down there. And I've mentioned this to Andrew Moriarty recently, that I've seen a change in fishermen behaviour down there, totally unsolicited, but they don't bring, you know, I used to see illegal sized fish being taken down there. I never said anything, all of that sort of stuff, because people actually couldn't catch a feed of fish, you know, when it was being netted several times a day and so forth. Now, fishermen can go out and catch good quality fish, and it's changed fishermen behaviour. I reckon that, you know, that it's not citizen science, but it's a cultural shift that's taking place because something's being put back in into the amenities. So the positive feedback is that if we give something back, and that's what we're actually trying to do as a board in some ways, and I know the fishing board does too, we can give something back to the licence holders.
Yeah. I'm not saying they're
going to be keener, and they'll help you.
That's right.
You know, the marlin tagging and all of those sorts of things that are taking place. There are fishermen out there now spending a large amount of money. That's citizen science.
Oh yeah.
That's engagement in the scientific activity without pay. In fact, they're paying for the privilege of putting a tag in to help others record info.
Most definitely, and I'm not saying they're all bad, or you know, not by a long shot. But I guess all I'm saying is that has happened in the past. Let's just all keep our eyes open.
Yeah.
That's all.
No, it's a good point, and I take it. That's just a throwaway slide, just to keep you amused.
Thanks, Rob.